So, let's talk about one of history's biggest disruptors, Martin Luther. We're going to dive into a question that honestly doesn't get asked enough.
No, really, think about it. You've just kicked off a revolution that's shaking 1,000 years of society to its core. What's your next move? For Martin Luther, the real work wasn't just in tearing things down, it was about figuring out how to build something new from the rubble.
He didn't see himself as a revolutionary trying to invent a new society from scratch, not at all. He was more like a master stonemason, trying to rebuild the walls of civilization using timeless materials. Things like the Ten Commandments and natural law, to build a world fit for this new understanding of faith. So let's dig into how he did it. First, we'll look at how he completely redefined the idea of work. Then we'll get into his pretty surprising economic views, followed by his blueprint for politics. And finally, we'll tackle the big one. What happens when your conscience goes up against the power of the state? All right, first up is maybe Luther's most radical social idea. He took this special concept of a holy calling, which for centuries was only for priests, monks, and nuns, and he gave it to everybody.
See, when Luther shut down the monasteries, he basically just erased the line between the sacred and the secular. Poof, gone. All of a sudden, there was no special holy zone you could retreat to. If you wanted to live a righteous life, you had to do it right in the middle of your messy, ordinary, everyday world. So, how on earth does that actually work? And this is where Luther gets really earthy and practical. He argued that God is right there with us, doing common jobs. He's the tailor who clothes the deer, the shoemaker who gives them tough hides. Christ was a carpenter, for goodness sake. Mary didn't quit her chores after the Annunciation, and those shepherds, after seeing a sky full of angels, they just went back to their flocks. All work became holy work.
And this quote just nails his whole point. For Luther, a mother changing a dirty diaper is showing the love of God in a more profound way than a monk who's just praying all day. Every single job, no matter how humble or gross, becomes a sacred stage to serve God by serving your neighbor. So, if every job is holy, how does that change your view on the economy? Well, given how often Protestantism gets tied to the rise of capitalism, Luther's actual economic ideas are, frankly, kind of shocking. You might think you know where this is going, but you're probably wrong. His ideal wasn't some bustling, profit-driven market. Nope, he imagined a simple farming society built on fairness and community. He even put this little cartoon in one of his pamphlets. It showed a peasant who borrowed a goose, and when he returned it, he also gave back all the eggs it laid while he had it. That was his model. You don't just give back what you took, you share in the blessing. This belief totally shaped his views on lending money. He despised the newfangled idea of charging a fixed interest rate, what we would just call a normal loan. To him, that was usury, plain and simple. His model was all about mutual risk. If I lend you money to start a business, I get a piece of your profits, sure. But if your business fails, I share in that loss with you. It's a partnership, not just a cold transaction. And here's the massive historical irony in all this. By championing this incredible work ethic, by sending all those monks and nuns out into the regular workforce, and by releasing all that church property into the secular economy, Luther's ideas accidentally poured gasoline on the very fire of capitalism that he personally couldn't stand. Okay, so we've covered work and money. What about politics? If our daily job is how we serve our neighbor one-on-one, how is society supposed to function as a whole? Well, for Luther, God basically has two different hands for running the world. This quote gets straight to the point. Luther was a realist, to say the least. He knew that the world is filled with people who aren't true Christians, and it always will be. Trying to govern an entire nation with only the Sermon on the Mount, he said that's like putting a bunch of wolves in a sheep pen and telling them to be nice. It's just not going to work. Society needs laws, and it needs force to back them up. And this brings us to his famous idea of the two kingdoms. Now, this isn't about two places on a map. You should think of them as two different ways God runs the show. One is his spiritual government, which operates through grace and persuasion, through the word. The other is his worldly or civil government, which operates through law and coercion, through the sword. This table lays it out perfectly. On one hand, you have the state. Its tool is the sword, and its job is to control our outward actions, to punish crime. You could say it's an expression of God's wrath against evil. On the other hand, you have the church. Its tool is the word of God, and its job is to deal with our inward being, with sin. It's the expression of God's mercy. Two different jobs, two different toolkits.
So you might be asking, why would a Christian ever participate in government as, say, a soldier or a judge? Luther's answer is incredibly simple: love. Not for yourself. As a Christian, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. But you have a duty, a calling, to protect your neighbor from harm. So being a police officer isn't just a job, it's a profound act of service to your community. Now, this whole two kingdoms thing sounds pretty neat and tidy, but what happens when the state goes off the rails? What's a citizen's duty when their ruler becomes a tyrant? This is where things get really complicated.
Luther was absolutely terrified of chaos and mob rule. He famously argued that it's better to suffer under one tyrant than to unleash a rebellion that creates 100 tyrants. So he was strongly against violent revolution. But, and this is so important, that does not mean blind, absolute obedience. He was crystal clear that civil disobedience becomes a moral duty in two specific situations. First, if the government orders you to do something that directly violates God's law, like when princes ordered people to turn in their German Bibles. And second, if the state commands you to fight in a war that is obviously and fundamentally unjust. This is where the church comes in. Its job isn't to be the state's cheerleader. Its job is to be the state's conscience. Just like Christ stood before Pilate, the church has to recognize the government's authority, sure, but it also has a holy obligation to speak truth to power and call out injustice wherever it sees it. And this brings us right back full circle to where we started. The judge has a calling. The pastor has a calling. The parent, the farmer, the citizen, everyone has a unique office, a unique station in life. For Luther, the whole key to a healthy society is for each person to faithfully serve God right where they are, without confusing their roles. And this final quote just sums up that tension perfectly. A Christian might be called to endure injustice at the hands of the state, but they are never, ever called to be silent about it. Suffering is passive, but testimony, speaking the truth, is active. You have to bear witness, even if it costs you everything. So there you have it. That's how Luther set out to rebuild his world. But let's be honest, his was a world of feudal lords and pretty simple economies. The real question for us is, what can our incredibly complex, globalized 21st century society still learn from a 500-year-old vision of holy work, shared economic risk, and a conscience that refuses to be silent in the face of power?